All right, welcome to today's web seminar, Building California's Response to Youth Homelessness, Year 3 of the Youth Set Aside. This is Simone Turek-Lee. I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Why don't we go ahead and get started? All right, so as you may have noticed, we've disabled the chat function. So all the questions that people will be submitting, we're asking that you just submit them centrally so that they're directed through Q&A through one thread as opposed to through both the chat and the Q&A box. So to send us a message or submit a question, please use the Q&A icon on the control panel, and we'll be collecting questions throughout the webinar, and then we'll answer them live at the end, unless it's a technical, like a Zoom related question or a question about whether we'll post the materials. Yes, we will. And we'll be sending those out to you as well. So we'll post them in our resource library on our website, which you can see on the screen there, and we'll send them out to everyone who registered for this webinar later this afternoon. So I'd like to just start us off by introducing myself and my colleagues. So again, my name is Simone Turek-Lee. I'm the Director of Housing and Health here at JBay, John Burton Advocates for Youth. And I'm joined today by Andy Lomelí, who is the author of the report that we'll be discussing today, and just joined JBay a couple months ago as a project manager in housing and health. So I'd like to welcome Andy. This is his first webinar with us. As you know, JBay is a webinar-heavy organization. We do a lot of webinars, and so this is his first one, and I'm thrilled to be working with him today on this. All right, so we're going to start off with just some framing on, what we call the Youth Set Aside, what today's webinar is on today. And then we'll walk through what round 2 of the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program looks like. And that's really what, again, what our focus is today. We'll dive into the contents of the report, the methodology, the findings. We'll spend a lot of time on the findings and on a handful of recommendations, both at the state and the local level. We'll provide also just a quick update, just a slide or two on a different program that also has a youth set aside, which is Home Key. We'll just provide an update there, and then we'll end with Q&A. So to provide a bit of context, kind of how did we get here to a place where, our state is newly investing in homelessness and in youth homelessness. It was really a policy response to a lack of federal investment. For a state where, close to, almost a third of people experiencing homelessness in the US are in California. For a state of our population, we really don't receive an equitable or a sufficient level of federal funding to address homelessness generally. And the federal government was really the main source of homelessness funding up until really 2018 here in our state. And in the realm of underinvestment, youth homelessness has been far less resourced. We've largely not been using our HUD funding, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development funding to serve youth. And really, the federal programs targeting youth are very, tiny amounts of funding. When you look at the point in time count data over a 5-year period between 2016 and 2020, youth on average made up 10% of our state's homeless population. Then when you compare that to the number of housing slots that are funded by HUD that youth are accessing, it's a very different picture. So when you look at the housing inventory count data, also from HUD, during that same 5-year period, just 3% of those housing slots were filled by youth. So that's just a little bit of context as kind of how we landed here, which is an unprecedented number or amount of really investment. $521 million in homelessness funding set aside for youth since 2018. When Governor Gavin Newsom came into office, we kind of, I think, turned and, really saw some new things happening with investments in homelessness and in youth homelessness. So the state started making large investments in homelessness, really starting a conversation at the state level about what the state's role is in ending homelessness here. And after several years of consistently, you know, prior to this, kind of after several years of consistently trying to get, a separate and a singular state program for addressing youth homelessness, kind of as advocates, that's what, for a lot of years we advocated for, and we're not extremely successful in with that strategy. We kind of turned to a different approach and said, let's be part of the main conversation. Let's incorporate youth into this mainstream effort to address homelessness. And so that's kind of where this started, with this 5% youth set aside in what was called the Homeless Emergency Aid Program in 2008. It was put into the 2018-19 state budget. HEAP, which we called it, was funded with $500 million, and then at least 5% at the local level. The local jurisdictions receiving HEAP funding were required to spend a minimum of 5%, which was $25 million collectively across the state, on youth homelessness specifically. And so that was the first sort of youth set aside. And as you can see, things grew incrementally, from there. After HEAP came HAP, the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program. So in 2019, that program was established. And we, along with other advocates, really continue to make the case for, a higher youth set aside amount, higher than 5%. We knew that on average youth were 10%. And we know that the point in time count is actually a pretty severe undercount, particularly of young people. And so we really wanted to see this percentage number grow. And the legislature and the governor were, responsive to that. And you can see HAP has an 8% youth, or had for rounds 1 and 2, an 8% youth set aside. It was also, in 2019-20, the overall funding went up a little bit. And then in 2021, we did have this very quick budget crisis just at the start of the pandemic. And so you can see it's a lower funding amount, generally $300 million, but the set aside was still 8%. And then we swung back very quickly, as you all know, and are not in a budget crisis any longer. And so we saw really a big increase in investments in 21-22, the current year's budget, where $1 billion was put into HAP round 3, and $1.4 billion was also put into Home Key, another program. And we had been watching Home Key round 1 the year before that, and it rolled out very quickly at the start of the pandemic, and right after Room Key. And we really did not see youth in that program. Because of that, because youth really largely weren't served by that program, we advocated for a set aside Home Key. So we started seeing, really some exciting results in the current year's budget, where we had HAP round 3, and we were successful in, the legislature and the governor, increased the funding amount to 10% for HAP. And then we also got a new youth set aside in Home Key. So we're looking, starting in this year's budget, at a large amount of money. 10% of $1 billion is $100 million for HAP, and then 8% of $1.4 billion, $116 million. So a lot of funding going out the door, targeting homelessness among young people. And the current year's budget included funding for this year and also for next year. So we know that what is in next year's budget is another billion in HAP, which is $100 million for youth, and another $1.3 billion in Home Key, which is $104 million for youth. So you can see we've gone from made a lot of progress since 2017, and just to kind of, maybe this is a spoiler of the webinar, but one of our main recommendation here is we want to see this funding. We want to see HAP be permanent. We are thrilled about this level of investment, but we know that it really needs to be an ongoing commitment in order to really address homelessness and youth homelessness. And so we hope to see that, this investment in HAP for youth be made permanent, or at least a longer term commitment beyond what will be round 4 in next year's budget. And we've issued reports, since 2019 on the youth set aside. So we've documented each year, just like this report that we're releasing today, how the money is being spent, how much and on what, and then several other kind of things that we're looking at. So let's dive in. I've spent enough time on this graphic, and just kind of a last slide on framing here. So how has the youth set aside really changed how we respond to youth homelessness? What's working about this approach? Well, the first one is really obvious, and I just basically said it. It's increased investment in youth homelessness, drastically. The second one, it's integrated youth into the local homeless response network. Youth providers are now sort of at the table at their local homeless continuums of care in many communities that they weren't so much at the table. And they're accessing HAP alongside adult providers. We found with HAP's predecessor, that significant infrastructure was really built by establishing local capacity in a lot of communities to administer youth homelessness funding. In 2019, we found that 44% of jurisdictions indicated that their continuum of care awarded funding to youth providers that had never before received continuum of care funding. So it's really building infrastructure. And I think it's also good because it's connecting the adult and the youth providers also. So there's not so much of what people can sometimes call like a cliff or a disconnect. It's also increased local understanding of youth homelessness and awareness. So CalICH, the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, previously called the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council, and this is the entity that at the state level administers HEAP and HAP. In one of their reports on HEAP, CalICH reported the youth set aside led to a renewed engagement around what unique services youth experiencing homelessness need, and as a result formed new partnerships around providing and expanding services. So I think that was very well said. Communities are kind of now seeing, wow, there is a youth homelessness issue, in communities that maybe didn't have that awareness previously. So another thing, it's expanded the continuum of housing options for youth. So like adults, like anyone, youth experiencing homelessness need a range of housing and service interventions. There's no one size fits all, and everyone is at a different stage in their challenges or in their struggles with housing. HAP has really enabled jurisdictions to fund a range of interventions based on local needs, including shelter, including navigation centers, including rental assistance, including rapid rehousing, including prevention, outreach, coordination, permanent housing. So a whole range of different interventions. And this is really, I would say, a significant improvement from prior to these investments, where some communities really just had like a single use program that offered one option. And while that's better than nothing, certainly, we're not knocking, any attempt at trying to address this issue, but just we know that having more options is better, and it will better meet the need. Lastly, just it's reached a broader population of young people. So many youth housing programs have very narrow eligibility criteria, especially in a world of scarce resources. You can't, open up the door to everyone. There's attempts to try to narrow things and meet very specific needs. And so, just for example, the state's transitional housing program for youth who are formerly in foster care. And again, not knocking this program. We are probably the number one advocates of this program. But this is a program where you have to be in care all the way up to age 18. And it's an important program, but it doesn't serve everyone. It serves as an explicit population of young people. And if you exit care prior to 18, or if you were never in care and you're experiencing homelessness, you can't access that program. And so what HAP does is it provides an opportunity to reach a much broader subset of young people, which is important. So today we released our most recent report documenting round 2 of HAP in regard to the youth set aside. And really what we're going to talk about today are the findings and the recommendations in that report. This is the 4th year we've released a report on the youth set aside, and you can download this report at that link. You can also download the other reports from our resource library, or the earlier reports. And I believe we have staff that are putting the link into the response to the Q&A box. So I think you should, I can't see it right now, but you should have links to both, I think, this PowerPoint and to the report. So just a little bit of information about more specifics about what HAP round two is. I'm going to provide that, and then I'm going to pass it over to Andy to jump into the findings. So, uh, this is just an overview of the round two of the Homeless Housing Assistance and Prevention Program. As I said earlier, it's administered by what is now called the California Interagency Council on Homelessness, formerly the Homeless Coordinating and Financing Council. That is an entity within the California Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. And HAP literally is a grant program designed to support regional coordination and expand or develop local capacity to address homelessness. In round two, it was funded with $300 million. And the way that it's administered is it goes from the state to three kind of categories of public entities. So our 44 homeless continuums of care in California received $81 million of this round two funding. And for those who maybe are a little bit newer to this field or just don't have a lot of familiarity with what continuums of care are, these are entities, they're kind of quasi-governmental entities. They're not perfectly aligned with cities or counties in particular. They're kind of regional bodies, and there are 44 of them. And they are really were established at the requirement of the federal government, of HUD, who uses these entities to get HUD funding administered locally. So HUD funding comes down from HUD, it goes to these continuums of care, and then the continuums of care push it out at the local level. And these continuums of care are sometimes nonprofit led, sometimes public agency led. It's really a very kind of unique arrangement and looks a little different in every region. And sometimes it is the same entity that is the county, and sometimes it's a different entity. And then the 13 largest cities in California also received funding, $121 million collectively. And these large cities are those with populations of 300,000 or more people. And then California's 58 counties also received funding. They received $82 million of funding. And as you all know, because we've just talked about it, there is a youth set aside in HAP. So during round two, we were at the 8% point, and so at least 8% of round two HAP funding was required at the local level to be spent on addressing youth homelessness. So eligible uses, there are really 8 eligible uses for HAP. Some of them are fairly broad. They're all identified as to be evidence-based. The first one is rapid rehousing, and that includes rental subsidies and incentives to landlords. Some of you who are following this closely may have noticed, HAP round one, incentives to landlords was a whole separate category. So the eligible uses are essentially pretty much the same in round two as round one, but they're organized a little differently. The second eligible use is operating subsidies in new and existing affordable or supportive housing units, shelters, navigation centers. So operating subsidies, street outreach, services coordination, and services coordination may include access to workforce, education, training programs, or other services needed to promote housing stability and supportive housing. So all of those kind of supplemental services. System support. So this may be about creating regional partnerships or maintaining, your homeless services and delivery system. This also, this is pretty broad reaching. So this is one of those categories that I think can kind of encompass a lot. And then delivery of permanent housing and innovative housing solutions, such as hotel and motel conversions. So again, innovative housing solutions could maybe be several different things. Prevention and shelter diversion to permanent housing, including rental subsidies. So there you see rental subsidies again, but this is really about prevention and shelter diversion. And then lastly, new navigation centers and emergency shelters. So in order to do that last one, to use your funding for that last one, you do have to demonstrate a need for this in your community. So that one's a little different than the others. So last slide here, I just want to kind of emphasize how HAP is administered. As I said, it flows from the state, from the Interagency Council to these 3 public entities at the local level, or I guess continuums of care, kind of semi-public entities. at the local level. And then these three entities have a process at the local level where they, maybe it's an RFP process where they administer their funding to local contractors, to nonprofits and service providers that do the work, that work with young people and with those experiencing homelessness. So this is how it flows at the local level and makes it down to actually, do the work. So there is usually a process that if you want to know how this happens in your community, you'd reach out to these local entities in your community and identify how HAP is administered locally. Now, in some cases, these entities may partner locally to do this. So maybe you see a county and a continuum of care doing this, the administering of the funding together. In some cases, it is separate. And in some cases, like I said, the continuum of care and the county may be the same entity. In San Francisco, for example, it's a very unique place. It's a city and a county and a continuum of care. So you have the same office or the same department. Basically, all three of these entities is the same thing. But in many communities, it's three different entities. So you really just have to inquire locally to understand how it's working in your community. And if you have questions or need help connecting to the right people, we're happy to help with that. So reach out to us about that if you'd like. So now I'm going to turn it over to Andy. Andy, as I said, is the author and the main researcher for this report. And so he is going to walk us through first the methodology and then walk through what we learned from the research. So Andy, please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Simone. And again, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. It's a true privilege to be able to speak with you this morning and present our findings on this report, which again represent an analysis of how COCs, large cities and counties across California utilized funding from round 2 of HAP to specifically serve youth. So let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide. And just a reminder, as we're going through these findings and recommendations, if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the Q&A and we'll hopefully get to it towards the end of the webinar. So first of all, JBay gathered data from 100% of COCs, cities, and counties that received funding from round 2 of HAP. And this data specifically looked at the amount of HAP funding each jurisdiction spent on youth and which of the 8 eligible uses were being funded by that specific youth set aside by each jurisdiction. This data was gathered from a combination of online surveys, phone interviews, and information taken directly from each jurisdiction's approved HAP application to Cal ICH. This information is supplemented with data from a subset of COCs, cities, and counties on the effectiveness of HAP funding and the estimated number of youth served through rounds 1 and 2. This subset includes data from COCs, cities, and counties that together received 58% of the statewide round 2 funding. This supplemental data was gathered from an online survey administered to local jurisdictions as well as phone interviews. And again, that's 17 COCs, 22 counties, and 5 cities. Can I take a look at the next slide, please? All right, so next we're going to look at the findings that we were able to derive from all this data that we took a look at. We can look at the first finding, please. So first of all, based on the data from respondents to date, we estimate that the HAP Youth Set Aside has served 11,052 youth across California through rounds 1 and 2. It's important to remember that not at the time of the survey, not all jurisdictions had allocated 100% of the funding that they plan to devote to youth during round 2. So this number is only going to increase. Next slide, please. So we asked the respondents 2 questions about the effectiveness of the HAP Youth Set Aside and found that a majority of respondents, about 85 to 90%, indicated that HAP funding was effective at addressing youth homelessness. First of all, we asked respondents to identify the effectiveness of HAP funding at reducing the number of youth struggling with homelessness. Excuse me. 1 second here. in struggling with homelessness in their respective jurisdictions on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all effective and 5 being extremely effective. As shown in the figure on the left, 86% of respondents graded the effectiveness at a 3 or higher, with 42% of respondents identifying a 4 or higher. We asked respondents using the same scale to identify the effectiveness of HAP funding at reducing the length of time it takes to house a youth experiencing homelessness. As you'll see on the chart on the right, 88% of respondents responded with a 3 or higher, and 40% responded with a 4 or higher. This data is going to be supported by respondents' overwhelming sentiment in their comments that the youth set aside has been instrumental in reaching the youth population, which we will look at in the next slide. So again, based on the respondents' comments in the survey, we saw that local jurisdictions support the youth set aside. These are some of the specific quotes that we pulled that we'd like to highlight now. One respondent representing a COC said that, quote, HAP has been critical to providing services to local homeless youth because it is one of the only funding sources that specifically sets aside resources for this population. A respondent representing a city said, quote, these funds have greatly assisted homeless youth in our city by expanding sheltering and program capacity. We have had a 45% rate of rehousing from these programs, which is better than other sheltering programs. A respondent from a county said, quote, the state mandated youth set aside is helpful because youth as a percentage are such a smaller population and jurisdictions could otherwise de-emphasize youth. And lastly, a respondent representing a city said that, quote, the fact funding is set aside for our youth ensures that this population is included in our efforts to end homelessness. So again, all tying into that theme that we're seeing through both the data and through the comments, that this is a critical source of funding for this population that is often going to be underserved. Can I take a look at the next slide, please? So again, we in the survey had asked jurisdictions how much of their funding allocation was being devoted toward youth specifically, and we also looked at those applications that were approved by Cal ICH. Statewide, we found that jurisdictions have invested or intend to invest 8.9% of the round 2 funding towards youth, which of course is above the 8% state requirement. You'll see here in this chart that all jurisdictions across California were allocated about $285 million. Of this, they collectively invested about $25.5 million toward youth, which again represents 8.9% of the total allocation. Next slide, please. So of all the jurisdictions, counties invested the largest share of their funding in youth, followed by large cities and COCs. Again, as you see in this chart, counties were collectively allocated about $82.3 million. Of this, they specifically allocated $7.7 million toward youth, which constitutes about 9.4%. COCs in large cities were pretty similar. COCs allocated 7.1 million of their 81.3 million, and large cities devoted about 10.5 million of the 121.3 million that they were allocated collectively. Next slide, please. So looking at those jurisdictions that specifically allocated more than the 8%, we have here the chart of every single jurisdiction that did, and saw that more than 1 in 5, about 21% of jurisdictions invested more than the required 8% in addressing youth homelessness among youth. Those being 7 COCs, 11 counties, and 3 cities. 2 jurisdictions, specifically Bakersfield County COC and Shasta County COC, reported investing more than 25% in youth. Kern County had the 3rd highest investment percentage at 22%. So we saw a lot of efforts, and we must applaud Kern County, they were also the first county to see 2 home key projects that were specifically devoted to youth. So great work being done up there. Next slide, please. Jurisdictions located in Northern California were the most likely to exceed the 8% youth set aside. As you'll see in this chart here, 30% of the jurisdictions located in the North, again, allocated more than the minimum 8% youth set aside. It's very interesting because this region also received the lowest amount of the statewide allocation. They received about 2% of the total HAP allocation. And then moving on to the next one, more than 1 in 5, about 23% of jurisdictions in the Central Valley exceeded the minimum youth set aside. And that region received about 8% of the total HAP allocation. The Greater Bay Area, they received about 26% of the total HAP allocation, and 21% of their jurisdictions exceeded the minimum youth set aside. The Mountain region, in the last round, they previously had the highest proportion of 31. This year, 14% exceeded the minimum youth set aside, and they received about 6% of the statewide allocation. And then finally, the Southern region, they received the largest proportion of the total HAP allocation. They received about 58% of the statewide funding, and 15% of jurisdictions in the South exceeded the minimum youth set aside. Next slide, please. So again, we took a look at how each of these jurisdictions were allocating the youth set aside toward the various eligible uses we identified earlier in this presentation. And we found that rapid rehousing was the most prevalent use funded by the HAP youth set aside. Rapid rehousing, so about 31% of the jurisdictions use their youth set aside on rapid rehousing, which was also the most common category funded in round 1. You'll note in this little point here, and we brought it up earlier, that there was a little bit of a change, but rapid rehousing in round 1 and incentives to landlord was 2 separate categories. This go round, they were included in 1 category and is still the most common eligible use amongst all of them. Just wanted to point out the second most common category in round 2 was operating subsidies in new and existing affordable or supportive housing units, emergency shelters, and navigation centers. And 25% of jurisdictions invested in that. And then the third most common category in round 2 was service coordination, with 21% of jurisdictions investing the youth set aside in that eligible use. Next slide, please. So this next chart breaks down the percentages by each type of jurisdiction. And we found that for COCs and counties, the most common use was rapid rehousing. For large cities, it was operating subsidies. So as you'll see here, 38% of all COCs invested the youth set aside in rapid rehousing. 29% of counties invested in rapid rehousing. And then large cities, 42% of them actually invested the youth set aside in operating subsidies. There's a lot of great data in this chart, and you'll be able to spend more time in it in the actual published report, which again, you can find online now. And let's look at the next slide, please. So on average, we saw that jurisdictions have invested or intend to invest in fewer than 2 eligible uses in round 2. You'll see in this chart, it's pretty apparent and overwhelming. 83.3% of cities, 73.5% of counties, 69.2% of COCs all invested their youth set aside into just 1 eligible use. Fewer and fewer in 2 eligible uses, and so on and so forth. No cities invested in 3 or 4 eligible uses. And then we have the averages down below. It breaks down to about counties allocating to, on average, 1.31 eligible uses, COCs 1.45 eligible uses, and cities 1.67 eligible uses. We estimate, and it's interesting because if you look at round 1, all these jurisdictions were investing in many more eligible uses. This number actually went down, and we estimate it's most likely due to the fact that the funding in this round just went down. It was halved from about 650 million to 300 million. So jurisdictions were just concentrating their resources into one or two effective eligible uses. Next slide, please. So we asked respondents whether or not they were allocating their youth set aside to fund projects that were targeting college students or that were collaborating with post-secondary educational institutions. A small but notable number of about 14% of respondents responded that yes, they were doing so. And we've taken the time to highlight a few of those examples here. San Francisco COC's Transition Age Youth Navigation Center has a partnership with the Community College of San Francisco and San Francisco State University, which includes a youth access point at San Francisco State. Vallejo Solano COC's Youth Outreach Program is providing services to transition age youth and supporting them with finishing their GED and or entering college. And then lastly, Fresno Madera COC is working with Fresno City College and their Project Hope to target college students unstably housed to assist with housing assistance and educational assistance. Next slide, please. And then just looking forward to the next couple of rounds of HAP, round 3 of HAP is going to reflect significant programmatic changes in HAP moving forward. First and foremost, the youth set aside will grow from 8% to 10%, meaning that jurisdictions will be required to use a minimum of 10% of their HAP allocation toward youth homelessness. There will also be some additional accountability measures. Each jurisdiction will be required to put together a local homelessness action plan. And there will also be bonus funding available to jurisdictions on top of their allocation that's going to be available and contingent based on meeting certain performance criteria. Funding beginning in round 3 will be incremental with an initial base allocation of about 20 to 25% to each jurisdiction. This base allocation can be used specifically to help complete that homeless action plan requirement or for systems improvement. And that systems improvement can include working on their coordinated entry systems to eliminate racial bias, or importantly, to create a youth-specific coordinated entry system. Lastly, jurisdictions will be able to spend up to 7% of their allocation on administrative costs. That's an increase of 5% from the previous round. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we saw that HAP in round 2 continues to promote collaboration amongst jurisdictions. For the purposes of regional coordination, jurisdictions were given the option to redirect their funding to another eligible applicant in the same region while engaging in joint planning and monitoring. A total of 14 jurisdictions, which includes 5 COCs, 8 counties, and 1 city, redirected their funding in this round, which totaled 10.9 million. 10 jurisdictions, 5 COCs, and 5 counties collectively received this 10.9 in redirected funding. During round 1, we saw 13 jurisdictions redirect their funding. So again, that number was fairly consistent. We did just see the city of Long Beach joining that list in this round. They were the only city to do so, and they redirected to Long Beach COC. And I do believe that will do it for the findings for now. And I will now pass it back to Simone, who will discuss some of our state level recommendations in the report.
Thanks, Andy. Excuse me. Thanks, Andy, for outlining all of our findings. And again, there's a lot more there. I know this was kind of a high level overview, but please, check out the report. And if you have questions about what's in the findings, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to shoot us an email. So I'm going to just start us off here with some state level recommendations based on what we learned this year. And then we're going to, after that, talk about some local recommendations for local jurisdictions. Oops. There we go. So I kind of alluded to this earlier. This is really our leading recommendation. Make an ongoing investment in HAP funding for youth. So that is what we would like to see. It is what I think the local jurisdictions would like to see. What you know those who are interested in ending homelessness for young people, I think, are interested in seeing long-term, permanent funding to do that. Respondents overwhelmingly, cited the effectiveness of HAP funding in helping to address youth homelessness, and similarly, kind of specifically appreciated the HAP Youth Set Aside as one of the few sources of funding that helps ensure youth populations are included in homelessness programming. So, this sentiment really underscores what makes HAP funding for youth distinct from HAP funding generally. While the adult sort of system of care has multiple funding sources to draw upon, and maybe not yet totally adequately resourced, not saying that, but definitely has a multitude of different funding streams that it draws upon. HAP is the main funding source right now, and really one of the only funding sources for specifically addressing youth homelessness that calls it out. So it is, I think we are uniquely positioned here in HAP, and have a lot to lose if HAP were to go away. So permanently funding the HAP program, and obviously inclusive of what is now the 10% set aside in rounds 3 and 4, would help ensure jurisdictions have the resources they need to address homelessness moving forward. And I think absent, really it's kind of like, or, so you see what's on the left there and then the little slash, and then what's on the right, it's like, or absent a commitment to permanently funding HAP generally, the state should permanently fund HAP for youth only. At the amount of the existing set aside in rounds 3 and 4, which is 10% of $1 billion, which is 100 million. So at a minimum, what this ask is $100 million for kind of HAP for youth permanently. Long-term kind of youth-centric funding can help build upon the infrastructure established through the first 2 rounds and the forthcoming 3rd and 4th rounds of HAP to ensure programming remains properly equipped and staffed for the foreseeable future. And it really guarantees, helps guarantee that California doesn't lose one of the few resources devoted specifically to youth homelessness. And we've developed this infrastructure. It now exists. Let's keep using it. Now, it goes without saying, we're thrilled that rounds 3 and 4 were funded in the current year's budget, and that the state of California's budget is so healthy. And because it is so healthy, the governor has proposed, on top of what is already in next year's budget for HAP, additional investments in homelessness. But these proposals are really targeting chronically homeless individuals. It's an encampment strategy and the care courts proposal, if you're familiar with that. We don't see youth in these strategies. These are really strategies, again, targeting chronically homeless individuals and those with severe mental health challenges. Youth generally don't live in encampments, and often, even if they're struggling with mental health challenges, these challenges have not progressed to a point yet where they're going to be picked up by the care courts. And I realize there are some differing beliefs on the care courts proposal. We're not here to debate those and say good, bad, ugly, whatever. We're just here to say that we don't see youth in these homelessness investments, and what we're asking for is a long-term commitment to addressing youth homelessness, and if not permanent, at least a multi-year post round 4 of HAP for youth. So I'll move us forward to our next recommendation, which is an idea for the state. Establish youth set-asides in additional sources of state funding for homelessness, where appropriate. We know that not every program would it make sense to do this for, but Home Key is a great example. It made sense in Home Key. The state responded. The state did that. That was great. We think that there's maybe other opportunities to do the same thing. HAP's minimum youth set-aside has really had a monumental effect or impact on the amount of funding available to serve youth experiencing homelessness in California. Investing, when you look at set aside totals across HEAP, HAP, and Home Key, $521 in new funding since since 2018. Several respondents identified how critical this set aside has been in serving this population because it's, again, one of the few sources devoted specifically for youth. California has an opportunity to really build on this success and momentum and establish similar youth set asides in applicable homelessness funding sources to ensure that a proportionate investment is made in youth. So just some examples that we could throw out there is, any future investments in capital infrastructure, beyond home key. And then maybe looking at things like maybe CASH, the California Emergency Solutions and Housing Program, and thinking through what that could look like. And what CASH is it's a 5-year, administers 5-year grants to administrative entities across the state. And so, there could be a minimum requirement in those grants as well to serve youth. Now, I'll also say that in addition to establishing set-asides, the state could also, I think, help improve access to mainstream homelessness funding to serve youth by providing some technical assistance. They've got some great TA providers right now that they're working with, both at Cal ICH and at HCD, Housing and Community Development Department. And so these entities could help the local entities. How do you use even non-specified youth funding to serve youth? So that's something that could be explored as well as on the TA side. So here our third recommendation. So make it a state priority to reach functional zero for youth homelessness specifically. So for those who may not be familiar with the idea of functional zero, this is really, when a community achieves functional zero for a population, they've reached a point when the local homeless services system is able to prevent homelessness whenever possible and ensure that when homelessness occurs, it's rare and brief and one time. So it's really about building capacity and infrastructure to meet the need and being able to be preventative and very quickly responsive. So it's bringing it to a level where it's considered functionally, solved, but understanding things, don't, nothing is perfect. We're not going to reach a point of perfection. That's not the way the world works. We need to be able to respond to less than perfect situations that people are experiencing and do that quickly. So reaching functional zero would be a great goal. In 2021, the Newsom administration announced the goal of functionally ending family homelessness within 5 years. That's fantastic. We love that. We think California can pursue this goal with the support through the structure within HAP for youth as well. Rounds 3 and 4 introduce performance-based bonus funding. So that could be an opportunity for the state to maybe establish incentives in future rounds for jurisdictions that can reach functional zero youth homelessness. Okay, so the next recommendation, develop a statewide youth-specific coordinated entry assessment tool that can be adopted by local jurisdictions. So first I want to pause and unpack this a little bit because I know that maybe some people are on the webinar that maybe aren't familiar with what coordinated entry is. So coordinated entry is something that is required by HUD, at the federal level, required of local continuums of care. Where it came from is, how do we, with scarce resources and with varying levels of need, how do people access services? It was the idea of coordinating at the local level so that there's not a wrong door and that things are, done in a coordinated manner. So everyone who tries to access, services through what's considered the homeless response system would be kind of assessed using a standardized tool and would be matched and referred with necessary resources, based on their level of need. And so the idea of coordinated entry is how do we make sure that first, the most in need and most vulnerable individuals and families are receiving the most robust services. It's also, like I said, about coordinating for the individual people trying to access services so that it's not all over the place, it's centralized. Now, the idea of coordinated entry is, it's the principle of it makes a lot of sense. Now, we know sometimes at the local level, the way that things are administered is less than perfect. And so particularly for young people, coordinated entry has not resulted, it has at times resulted in youth being actually screened out of services. And it's not just an issue for youth. This is an issue that goes beyond youth, but it's particularly, I think, challenging for young people. And one issue is there is a standardized tool that is used and it's called the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool, a mouthful, the VSPDAT, to assess people that are coming through coordinated entry. Some jurisdictions, LA, for example, has said, this tool isn't working for young people. We want to adopt a tool that is specifically for young people. And so they adopted what is called the Next Step tool. And the Next Step tool is designed to really be used in place of the VSPDAT for all youth and young adults under the age of 24. And the idea is it's a more accurate assessment of their vulnerability, and it considers the distinct aspects of youth, and is able to prioritize youth for the right services and housing. Now, again, things are less than perfect, right? So the Next Step tool, I would say, is better than the VSPDAT for youth, but it is not perfect. The tool's critics definitely cite it as needing further honing to better accommodate a wide range of young people. And I'm sure if people in LA are on the line, they're probably talking to their computer right now and have feelings and opinions about this. And we agree. Let's hone it. Let's further hone it. Let's make it better. But all that being said, the existence of this tool and using this tool definitely represents progress with respect to coordinated entry for youth. And so, the recommendation here is, how do we get something recommended statewide that's a better assessment tool for young people, and getting jurisdictions to use that. So the recommendation is, let's develop a statewide tool. And our idea here is, there is a soon to be launched youth and young adults working group that Cal ICH will be launching, I believe, this year. And this is a group that maybe could help with the efforts of honing this tool, working closely with LA, and then maybe make some recommendations for statewide use. So we think that that's a group that could spearhead that. But something that is definitely comes up a lot is this issue of coordinated entry. So there's an idea there. I think this is the last state level recommendation. Yeah, it is. And then so after this, we'll move to the second and last set of recommendations. But this last one is continue to incentivize collaboration and coordination among jurisdictions. So really, it's a soft recommendation. It's keep doing what you're doing and keep thinking about ways to do it even more. The state is doing this. So they are in HAP in rounds 3 and 4. They're continuing to try to think of ways and program this into HAP. How do we encourage and incentivize and promote collaboration and coordination, particularly across cities, continuums of care, and counties within one region? That's 3 different entities. So, the ability to redirect allocations is certainly an indication of collaboration. You're engaging in joint planning and monitoring with that redirect. 14 jurisdictions redirected their funding in rounds 2. Rounds 3 and 4 continue to encourage this coordination and collaboration. And we just are saying here, should there be funding appropriated beyond round 4, which we hope there is, strategies for how to further incentivize these activities should be considered. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Andy to kind of bring us home on our local recommendations for those kind of continuums of care or counties, maybe cities. I think the bulk of them might be it's for across, I think, all 3 of those groups. But I'm going to turn it over to Andy now, and then we will jump into an update on home key and Q&A.
Thanks, Simone. And again, yes, so these recommendations are going to be ones that we're specifically giving toward jurisdictions, the COCs, counties, and cities to more effectively and efficiently use the youth set aside to serve the community with their HAP allocation. So let's go ahead and look at the first slide. First of all, we recommend that jurisdictions use the rounds 3 and 4 of their HAP funding to improve coordinated entry for youth. We've devoted a bit of time thus far toward this particular topic, but we want to emphasize that rounds 3 and 4 specifically list systems of improvement as an eligible use of their base allocation. If you remember us talking earlier about the 20 to 25% base allocation that's going to go to every jurisdiction. Those systems improvement include improving coordinated entry systems to eliminate racial bias or creating a youth-specific coordinated entry system. So again, this is just, the money is there, the funding is there for folks to use this as an eligible use, to use their base allocation. We really recommend that jurisdictions jump on that and actually do so. As we mentioned, this is an area in need of great improvement. Youth, because they have not necessarily been homeless for a very long amount of time, they may not necessarily be deemed, quote, in need, and therefore can be screened out of housing through the existing coordinated entry systems, and will lose out on some critical resources that would otherwise be available for them. And we have 3 specific examples on the bottom of how jurisdictions can use their base allocation. And that is 1, improving the coordinated entry assessment tool locally, 2, implementing a youth-specific tool, and 3, establishing youth-specific coordinated entry access points. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide, please. We are also going to recommend that jurisdictions apply for YHDP funding. YHDP, Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program, is administered by HUD, and it provides a one-time funding to COCs to develop and implement a coordinated community approach to prevent and end youth homelessness. Thus far, California has seen 7 COCs successfully apply and receive funding, totaling about $50.38 million in the past couple of years that has been allocated towards COCs across the state. And we see this as such a critical resource, especially given respondents' statements saying that HAP is one of the few funding sources available to target homeless youth. Securing YHDP funding would, again, provide more youth-specific funding for comprehensive planning, as well as ongoing funding for programming. So the YHDP and YHDP also requires a coordinated community plan as part of their application. That could be critical and helpful for a lot of these jurisdictions as they're putting together their homeless action plan. That's a requirement in round 3 and 4 of HAP. JBay is very invested in making sure that more California COCs successfully join the 7 COCs that have already received funding. And we are offering planning grants to individual COCs' efforts to apply for YHDP funding. Last year, JBay awarded Everyone Home, that's Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda COC, and they subsequently received a YHDP award of $6.57 million. You have me and Simone's contact information that'll be provided at the end of the presentation as well. So feel free to reach out to us for more information on how you can receive one of those grants. Next slide, please. Similarly, we recommend, just one more note on YHDP, the application deadline for this next round is going to be June 28th. So that's coming up in just a few months. Sorry about that. And moving on to the next slide on HomeKey, we are similarly going to recommend that jurisdictions apply for HomeKey funding to develop housing for youth. So while HAP provides a unique opportunity for jurisdictions to fund programming, we still think that that existing housing crisis presents serious limitations to individuals seeking housing, as well as to programs that are attempting to provide housing. So jurisdictions across the state can help ensure that the HAP funding is used efficiently by applying to HomeKey in the first place. And that would help them increase the amount of physical housing available for transition age youth in the first place. The deadline for the next round of HomeKey is May 2nd. And in just a couple slides, Simone's going to go over an update on how the second round of Home Key is going so far in terms of serving youth. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we're going to recommend that jurisdictions explore how HAP can address college student homelessness. We talked earlier in the report about how 14% of respondents said that they were funding projects that were partnering with institutions or that were specifically outreaching to college students. And this number can only go up. So 29%, research in 2019 found that 60% of California community college students were housing insecure, and that 19% of these students experienced homelessness in the previous year. We recommend, again, utilizing HAP to address this issue. HAP provides jurisdictions with the opportunity to specifically explore partnerships and establish programming that's going to serve this college age population. And I believe that's it for the jurisdictions recommendations. And I will pass it back to Simone to provide an update on the current state of Home Key funding.
Thanks, Andy. Yes, that is what we are doing. So Home Key, so shifting gears a little bit. So HAP, shifting gears for a second. So Home Key. So if you heard earlier, Home Key is a program or a program that the state established during the pandemic, and it followed Project Room Key, and it is about moving people into long-term or permanent housing, and building on the success of Room Key and kind of temporarily housing people, and then moving to something more long-term. So that's why it was established. And the first round of Home Key served had two projects of about, I think, 90 something that served youth specifically. So in response to that, the state made a point of establishing a youth set aside in round two. And now there's an 8% youth set aside. And so we've been working really closely with the State Department administering Home Key, which is the California Department of Housing and Community Development, and their TA providers. And they are very committed to this youth set aside. And so we've been very closely watching all the projects be awarded in round two. And I guess I didn't cover the funding level, but yeah, round two is $1.45 billion. There is a 8%, $116 million youth set aside. And as Andy mentioned, that is almost done. May 2nd, I believe he said, is the, it's on the slide, is when round two closes. Round three will launch in the fall. It'll be a $1.3 billion program and 104 million set aside for youth. So that's what it is in a nutshell. To date, like as of the last publicly posted awards, unless something's changed since I think yesterday when we last looked at it, 55 projects have been awarded in round two. And of those projects, 11, which is 20%, 1 in 5, are will explicitly serve youth. These projects are not, they're in the process. They've been awarded the funds, and now they have to develop their housing. So what that looks like as far as youth level is a total of 196, youth households will be served through these projects. And kind of the breakdown of what those projects look like, 4 exclusively serve youth, 7 are mixed population projects, and at least 25% of the units are set aside for youth within those mixed population projects. All in all, the majority of the 8% set aside in round two has been awarded, and kind of final results coming soon. We'll know next month, I think, what the final results are. And we're really encouraged so far at the projects that have been awarded and are excited. And I want to just say, the first, I think Andy mentioned this earlier, Kern County, Bakersfield, they were the highest investor in youth as far as percentage. Proportionately, they invested more in youth for HAP for round two than any other jurisdiction across COC, city, county, I believe. And I was thinking, they are really coming through for youth, because they were the first 2 projects that served youth in Home Key or Bakersfield, Kern projects. So if you're on, if someone from that area is on the webinar, I just want to give you some props because you're really you know, really prioritizing young people, and it's very, very exciting to see that happening in the Central Valley. But yeah, so I digressed a bit, but we will certainly be sharing the final results of Home Key, and we'll be doing so through a webinar. So I do want to invite you all to a webinar. We don't have a registration link quite yet, but it will take place. Please save the date on May 25th from 10 to 11:30. We will circulate registration to everyone who is on this webinar in the coming weeks. And the webinar will discuss the youth set aside in Home Key and highlight 2 round 2 projects serving youth. I'll just say a little snippet about each of those projects. One is in Ventura County with a newer organization that is the service provider, and that organization is called MESA. And they are working in partnership with their local public entity, Ventura County, as the Home Key lead applicant. They're rehabbing a 10-acre property to develop housing for 12 youth ages 18 to 24 in a youth-only project. And they're providing interim, transitional housing. And this is a project that was awarded $4.2 million. So one of the smaller projects that's targeting young people, and I think is going to be a really great project. I'm excited to follow its progress. We'll also be featuring, kind of on the flip side, a mixed population project. And that's a project in Napa that's converting the Wine Valley Lodge, which is a old hotel, into 54 units of permanent housing. So they'll be serving a mixed population of people, and that includes 14 units for youth. They're working with the city of Napa and then Burbank as the housing developer. And the providers on the project are Abode Services and Voices. And that's a $15.1 million project. So 2 kind of different types of projects that we'll be featuring, and we'll also be releasing kind of profiles on these projects with more information. So if any of you are on the webinar, thanks for being good sports and sharing information with us. And we're really excited to share information about these projects yes, it is next month. So here we're going to stop and move into Q&A. Thanks everyone for submitting questions. If you have questions still, please feel free to keep bringing them in. I want to start with one question about YHGP. So I'm just going to back up the slide to that YHGP slide. I think there was just some confusion. And so I'm guessing if one person was confused, maybe some other people were as well. So I want to clarify this, the difference between kind of these YHGP funding awards coming from the federal government versus J-based planning grants, which are very different things. So J-Bay is offering planning grants in the amount of up to $10,000 to continuums of care who want to apply for YHGP funding from HUD. So the planning grants are really designed to, they're flexible. It's really about how do we help you build your capacity to put forth your best forth your best application. So it could be a consultant to lead that planning application process to apply for YHGP. It could be maybe a grant writer to write up the proposal if you have lack some capacity in your kind of development team or development person, or there's different sizes of continuums of care. They have different levels of capacity, and so we want to help you build that capacity out. It could be help with stipends for the youth board that's required to apply for YHGP. So it is flexible, and there's not a form to fill out. It's really email me or Andy, and we'll talk this through and what this might look like. So these are meant to be, we're not trying to create another application process before the real application process you have to do. It's supposed to be simple. So reach out if you're interested, if your continuum of care is considering applying for YHGP and you think a little bit of additional funding to help you get there could be helpful. So that was just the YHGP question. Kind of back to our Q&A here. So I want to answer first. There was just a question very early on, which is, oh, and I lost it, but I know what it was. It was, what is the difference between HEAP and HAP? And I think that's a really good question. There were a number of differences. I think I'll cover just the main questions. One is kind of with you thinking about youth first, is that HEAP was a 5% youth set aside, and HAP had an 8% youth set aside, and now in rounds 3 and 4 has a 10% youth set aside. So the set aside amounts are different. Kind of the stepping back a little bit, HEAP was really about it was the emergency aid program. It was, how do you address your most pressing needs right now? And HAP is a little bit more planning and thinking forward than HEAP was. And the eligible uses differ. So HEAP, for example, you could capital development was an eligible use of HEAP. That is not what HAP is for. So there's some differences in the eligible uses. And there's also just in HAP, there's kind of more planning and accountability. So there's other differences as well. I'm sure if Cal ICH was on the line, they'd be able to detail every difference. I probably can't rattle that off the top of my head, but if you're interested in learning more, you could also go onto the Cal ICH website and look at the different information about the different programs. So another question we got, Andy, I will pitch this one to you. Can you repeat which counties allocated the most toward youth? So what I'll do is I'll go back to the slide, and if you want to just kind of step through kind of the top few counties, maybe.
Sure thing. So again, these were this was 21% of counties that allocated more than 8%. And we saw that the ones that gave the most were Bakersfield, Kern County COC, as well as the Reading Shasta COC. Also, I believe commonly referred to as the NorCal COC. Those both gave about 25.9%. Kern County was the highest county. They gave 21.7%. And I'll also just point out, because I don't think I did it during the presentation, that the highlighted jurisdictions are ones that received redirected HAP funds from a partner jurisdiction. And you'll see that throughout our report, as well as in these other charts, that the jurisdictions that are highlighted received those reallocations.
Thanks, Andy. So our next question is just a question about this. This always comes up, right? How are youth defined? How are homeless youth experiencing homelessness defined? So the legal definition, and thank you, Anna, our staff, Anna, who is kind of behind the scenes here, responding to people with some of the technical questions, put this in the chat for this person, but I'll just read it out loud. So in statute, homeless youth means an unaccompanied youth between 12 and 24 years of age, inclusive, who is experiencing homelessness as defined basically in the federal McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act. And it clarifies homeless youth includes unaccompanied youth who are pregnant or parenting. And I also just want to say, that is the definition of youth, but remember, HAP is not just for youth. So there's no stop, you don't have to stop serving young people at 24. HAP is for people of all ages. So that is the definition of who is kind of served by the youth set aside, but HAP funding is way more broad than that. So just remember that when you're thinking about kind of HAP programming more generally. Let's see. Well, this one I want to is like a question and a statement, and I want to just read it because I couldn't say it better. And we totally agree with this. It says, how are we ensuring that these dollars remain flexible and suitable to support the needs of youth, to stabilize them, and to prevent a housing crisis? These funds are coming down so aligned with HUD COC with restrictive screening prioritization processes that young people and the communities from which they come are not receiving the full benefits of the funds. We need to reevaluate how these funds play a role with coordinated entry. So we 100% agree that coordinated entry needs improvement. We need to make coordinated entry work better for young people. And I do want to say, in response to this, and we've talked with folks at the state level about this too, there are a lot of, this does get complicated at the local level for continuums of care that are adhering and are expected to adhere to federal requirements. And there are, I think, there's hesitation at times, like, if we make an exception here, for this program, the state funded program, are we somehow in violation of this federal requirement? HUD requires that you use coordinated entry. HUD requires that you use housing first. There's a bunch of different things that HUD requires. And the state is fairly aligned with that. But I think that when we've talked to folks at the state level, it's very clear coordinated entry is not supposed to be a tool for screening people out. It is supposed to be a tool for assessing need. So, for example, when you have, and we see this play out for youth that have been in foster care, we see this play out for youth who are in college, where they're kind of accidentally screened out of services that they're almost categorically eligible for. We have to remember that coordinated entry is not actually black and white. So when there's information in state law that says you have to coordinate with coordinated entry, or you have to utilize coordinated entry or a comparable prioritization process, that does not mean screen youth out. That means there has to be an organized manner in which services are being administered. So I think that there's a lot of work that we could do both at the state level to provide some local technical assistance to continuums of care that are under pressure from the federal government to do things a certain way, and are experiencing and viewing that pressure in a certain way, and helping provide some guidance on how to apply that to state funding. So I think that there's a lot of work to do there. And thank you for submitting that comment, because it's an area that we'd also like to see improve, which is these kind of local obstacles that come up because of coordinated entry. And understanding that coordinated entry was developed for a reason. So trying to make it work for young people. So someone said, can you please give a more specific example of what it means to share funds with different jurisdictions? Is that assisting another agency hire additional staff, opening referral programs, funding housing opportunities outside of your own program? So I think here, what I'll just say, and Andy, if you want to add to this, I think you're referring to the kind of the HAP redirects. What that means is, let's give a real example. So let's say we'll use Oakland, Alameda, just because that's where I live in Alameda County. So I'm just going to use this as an example. I'm not saying this is how it's happening there, but let's say the continuum of care in Oakland, Alameda County get their funding, and then the county of Alameda also has their funding, and then the city of Oakland also has their funding. There is an option where, let's say, for example, the county of Alameda or the city of Oakland says, we really want to combine our efforts with the continuum of care. The continuum of care has their eyes on regional homelessness needs, and they have a system that they use. We want to leverage and we want to take advantage of that system and be coordinated. And so we are going to actually have the state move our funds to that continuum of care. And so it's becomes one pot of funding versus 2 or 3 different pots of funding. And we are going to work collaboratively with them to develop the plan for using those funds and how it rolls out. So that is what a redirect is. It's really about joining forces to administer kind of one set of funds versus doing 3 separate, things with that funding. So I hope that I don't know, Andy, if you want to elaborate or make anything clear that I said.
No, I think that answers it. I will just add that, one interesting fact is that multiple jurisdictions can redirect to one other jurisdiction, which is what we saw. Amador, Calaveras, Mariposa, Tulum County, COC was redirected from several of the smaller counties within that COC. We also saw Alpine, Inyo, Mono County COC received from, I believe, 2 or 3 of the counties within that COC.
That's a great point. So some of the rural areas like Tuolumne, Amador, Alpine, it might make more where there's less young people. It might make sense for them to join forces and look at a regional approach versus, when you're and there's just the populations are smaller. So it's not the same situation as when you have a LA or San Francisco or any of these larger urban concentrated areas where there are higher, there does tend to be, higher homelessness rates, and there are more people. So sometimes a regional approach can make a lot of sense, particularly for those rural communities. So thank you, Andy, for that example. Let's see if we have any other questions. I'm just gonna go to the, well, this person actually has a comment I'd like to read. It relates to some of the things that we've raised. It says 1/4 of UC Berkeley students have experienced homelessness since the beginning of this academic year. UCs are affected at a record level right now. I was definitely not aware of that, of 1/4. That is a very high number. We've typically seen the UC numbers be lower than the community college numbers and even the CSU numbers. But that is, wow, that's very concerning. Thank you for sharing that. I think this just underscores, and I'm sure pandemic, ding ding ding, like that's I'm sure what's going on, but that definitely underscores. And then this person clarified 11,000 students since the beginning of the school year at Cal. So this just underscores that we need to, this is a population, college student homelessness, that has been really overlooked, because I think people, they think if you're in college, you're doing okay. You're okay. You can figure it out. But that's just not always the case. Young people, we know young people that are just barely holding on housing wise, and they are still staying enrolled in school. So we need to remember that those are in need populations when we're thinking about how to program our homelessness dollars as well. So I'll just sifting through the questions again and seeing if I missed anything big here. And then after that, maybe one more question we can close. Someone just asked what percentage of eligible entities received HAP round 2 funding. So I just want to, I think, Andy, do you want to just clarify that, that this is not a competitive program?
So 100% of of the jurisdictions, COCs, counties, and cities that applied, that's all of them, were able to receive funding. The numbers after the reallocations may be a little bit different, but every jurisdiction did receive that initial allocation. Some of them, again, chose to redirect toward a different, but every jurisdiction did receive at least some initial funding.
Thanks.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to add that was based on multiple factors, the amount of the allocation based on their point in time count, as well as several different factors. And that, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Andy. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions and for sticking with us this morning. I know it's a busy time of year, so we appreciate your participation today. We'll be sending out the materials later this afternoon from the webinar, and please don't forget to join us on Wednesday, May 25th in the morning for a webinar on HomeKey featuring 2 youth projects. Thanks, and have a great rest of the day.